So, my name is Renata Chakasang. I am the CEO for the Women and Gender Equality Commission. The Women and Gender Equality Commission this morning is hosting a conference on CEDAW. CEDAW, of course, is the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It is an important document, and it's an important treaty. It is also known in local parlance as the Women's Bill of Rights. And as such, we want to place some degree of importance and emphasis on this particular convention. We're happy that you've been able to make time to come, and we hope that today you will learn, you will be excited, and you will be inspired to make some changes. I see there's some men in the room. Some of them look quite worried when I said it's the Women's Bill of Rights. But I assure you that you benefit from this as well. And your job, I guess, today would be to ensure that your part is played and your voice is heard. And if you hear anything you're not quite comfortable with, we are willing to dialogue with you. We have lined up for you, we hope, an interesting lineup of speakers. I've heard them. They explain things and put things over in very interesting ways, so I doubt you'll be bored. I know we have some students here, and they're wondering, why are we here? But hopefully you're here to learn, because you are the future, and we hope that you make a bigger and better Guyana. It's on your shoulders, because we all be retiring, right? Right. So, I want to bring first to the podium the chairperson of the Women and Gender Equality Commission, Mrs. Indrani Chandapal. The commission is 10 years old, so more than 10 years old, and she's been our chairperson for the entire length of that time. She has a wealth of experience. She's been a former Minister of Housing, Human Services, what else? And Social Security. So her experience is wide. She's been a woman in politics for a very long time, and for those of you who are hesitant to step yourself into politics because of what you heard, she certainly has been courageous enough to put herself forward. So without further ado, Ms. Chandapal.
I trust that you are indeed having a great morning. I know that it has always been a difficulty to start at 9 o'clock. All the traffic congestion on the road and everything else, and to get you here, I know it's always a sacrifice. And so let me start off by thanking all of you for making all the arrangements that are necessary in order to get you away from work or home to be at a conference such as this, in which you are required to spend some time with us. So on behalf of the Commission, I want to extend our sincerest thanks to all of you for being here. As was stated before by our CEO, when she said that the CEDAW is a Bill of Rights, I want to endorse that statement because it is indeed so. But my task at this point in time is to tell you a little bit about the Women and Gender Equality Commission. As you know, the Commission was set up in 2003, and when it was set up, prior to that, there was a National Commission on Women. And the National Commission on Women had focused on some of the CEDAW clauses. And when the Constitutional Commission in 2003 met, and there was this whole dialogue that took place with respect to the Rights Commission, the Women and Gender Commission incorporated some of the CEDAW clauses. And you will hear later on that there are 30 clauses in the CEDAW Convention. And actually, the CEDAW Convention came into force in 1979, and it was Guyana ratified in 1980 on the 17th of July. And as we all know, that once a country ratify a convention, there are a number of things that the country has to do. It is a requirement that all those things that are contained in the convention, we are supposed to undertake a number of those. So when in 2003, the the Constitutional Reform Commission met, they incorporated 14 out of the 30 CEDAW Convention. And that is what we in the Commission, we are mandated to work towards. Now, it would be important for me to share with you what are those mandates of the Women and Gender Equality Commission. And the first one is the Women and Gender Equality Commission will promote the issues related to the enhancement of the status of women, girls, and gender issues. That's the first. The second is to promote the integration of women needs and interests and mainstreaming of gender issues. The third is to promote the empowerment of women. The fourth, promote women's rights as human rights. The fifth, to raise the awareness of the contribution of women and problems faced by women, including the recognition and value of unwaged work. Promote women's needs, interests, and concerns in the wider spectrum of economic and social development and address both the practical and strategic needs of women as being different from those of men. 7 is to educate and monitor employees and the public on desirable employment practices in relation to women and men. 8 is to monitor compliance and make recommendations for the compliance with international instruments to which the government accedes from time to time, including those already acceded to and which relates to the purpose of the mission. 9 is to evaluate any system of personal and family law, customs and practices, or any law likely to affect gender equality or the status of women, and make recommendations to the National Assembly. 10, recommend and promote the implementation of legislation and the formulation of policies and measures so as to enhance and protect the status of women. 11, promote, initiate, or cause to be carried out research and the creation of databases on women and gender-related issues, including those of health, especially reproductive health, violence against women and the family, and their socio-economic and political status as the Commission may deem relevant or as may be referred to it by the National Assembly. 12, promote consultation and cooperation with women organizations in relation to decision-making that affect the lives of women. 13, recommend training and technical assistance to support initiatives by and for women and girls and promote the participation of women in national decision-making. And finally, 14, promote the participation of women in national decision-making. So these are the 14 mandates that is contained in the Constitution and that binds us as a Commission to ensure that we do all that is required to ensure these things. Well, imagine a situation where you have 15 women who have been elected from a wide cross-section of society, and they have to work together to ensure that these 14 mandates are undertaken and that we give effect to them. The first thing we had to do, because we have not had the opportunity of working together on common issues, was to build that relationship among ourselves. So the first 6 months of the life of the Commission was to understand our mandate, because the Constitution gave us 14 mandates, but nobody sat down with us to say, hey, this is what you're supposed to do. We had to figure it out for ourselves. I'm pleased to say that after 12 years, we have had only one time taken a vote on an issue. And it just goes to show how together we were able to talk over an issue, discuss them, and arrive at a consensus. And this is the way in which we have operated over all these years. The other issue I want to bring to your attention is that we work with stakeholders, because it was the stakeholders who initially voted for the 15 persons. And we believe that it was necessary for us to always work with them, keep them in mind, bring them up to date, get their views so they can know what are the issues that we are discussing, what are their concerns, and how we should ensure that their concerns are met, and that we promote those. So that is the mechanism in which we started out with. As I speak, there is presently an initiative in which the Commission life will come to an end, and there is already election of different entities choosing a nominee who will then be part of that 15-person commission, which can be both men and women. It doesn't really matter because as our name is, Women and Gender Equality Commission, we should not be biased in any way against our male or female in that way. So that process is happening. So the Commission, having recognized that CEDAW is very important to us, we thought it necessary to ensure that a conference such as this is held in which all the players, a lot of you, are brought together so that we can share with you some of the things that are important for your own education. But having said that, I just refer to the 14 mandates. And I want to say this, that one of the mandates, or one of the things that we are required to do is on an annual basis, we are required to lay a report in Parliament outlining and detailing all the issues that all the things that we as a Commission have done. I just refer to our stakeholders. As a rule, we have been reaching out to our stakeholders right across the country in various outreaches. Some of you, I see, are here that have benefited from the outreaches that we have initiated or participated in. And this has been done in all 10 regions of Guyana, in which a number of recommendations were made. Now, the way we operate is that we have a strategic plan, and the first strategic plan we had was from 2013 to 2018. And the areas that we looked at in the first strategic plan is the organizational and institutional strengthening of the Women and Gender Equality Commission. That was the first. The second, women, leadership and governance. The third, women and economic empowerment. And the fourth, gender-based violence. So we have done a number of things with respect to that first 5-year strategic plan, and we made recommendations to the Parliament. I will, in a little while, give you an outline of some of those recommendations for you to understand what are the concerns of the Commission. And those commissions came out of our outreaches in where women from the grassroots, women and men, spoke about their issues, their concerns, and what they would like to see the Commission do. The second annual report, 2021-2026, and this framework for the strategic plan, we coined it gender justice. And the first one is access to justice. The second is human rights. Third, equity and economic development, and participation in decision-making on gender and social justice issues. And the fifth is access to health and social services. Now, with respect to the laws, I would have said to you as one of the mandate, we're supposed to look at the laws, and under 11, that we promote, initiate, or cause to be carried out research and the creation of database. So this is something that we did in 2018, in which we initiated what is called, we hired a consultant to evaluate the laws relating to women and to make appropriate recommendations where necessary. And this report was presented to stakeholders on the 9th of March on the occasion of International Women's Day. The report was adjusted after consultation, and thereafter it was printed and presented to the Speaker of the National Assembly for members of parliament and the public. The consultant evaluated 277 pieces of legislations and conventions, and arising out of that, 28 recommendations were made to the Parliament for consideration and implementation. So one of the mandate in the Constitution, we carry that out to the extent in which we have this document that was laid in Parliament with 28 recommendations. The other issue I want to bring to your attention is what we do on an annual basis is to make recommendations to Parliament with respect to the issues that were raised by our stakeholders. And for example, we started off by looking at sexual harassment legislation. And we recommended that CARICOM legislation on sexual harassment in the workplace must be adapted to be used internationally. Second, that Women and Gender Equality Commission to be a part of government's delegation to meetings of CEDAW, and WGEC to follow up with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm just talking about the recommendations, not the actions. And ensure what is happening with CEDAW. WGEC should be a part of the delegation, and we also need to be a part of the preparation of the shadow report with NGOs. And this is something, and I'm hoping, arising out of today's discussion, and when we will be looking at the workshops in which you will be participating, recommendations can come out from you in order for us to incorporate those into any report that will be presented. And to review the selection process of jurors with a view to widening the pool of eligible persons. And we thought this was important because the jury system in Guyana has not been updated for a long time. And there are people who are part of the jury system that do not have, I believe, the necessary skills in order to do the work. Because it's the same pool that they have been going into over and over, and we thought it was time for that pool to be expanded, take into consideration the new realities and the new issues which are emerging in society. We talked about sensitization program to be implemented for tip and sexual offenses. We talked about the Ministry of Education to launch psychosocial counseling units, the creation of policy and sexual harassment at the place of work. I'm not going into all the detail, just touching them very briefly. Guidance and counseling centers should be available in schools. We talk about all cases of TIP should be dealt with by relevant specially trained magistrates, resuscitation of the domestic violence unit in stations, meeting with Chancellor to lobby for specially assigned domestic violence court to deal with courts expeditiously. We did those. All cases of domestic violence and sexual offenses be dealt with by relevant specially trained magistrates. At one time, we had the opportunity, as a result of the initiation of the then Attorney General, we met all the magistrates and we were able to talk to them about our concerns with respect to the variation of sentences. And so we had a discussion on that, and they promised to do the necessary. We talked about noise nuisance. I'm sure a lot of you will agree that this is a public health issue. And we all say probably half of Guyana, we're deaf. We don't have proper hearing because of the violence, violence to our ears by the loud music. You can't talk about it because the young people will say, hey, you know, we're young, we need to have it. You old people don't speak about this. You know, you had your day, that kind of thing. But we know it's a public health issue. We also, this is very important, the domestic violence victims who do not want to pursue prosecution against a perpetrator. We've had lots of this where people went to the courts, and then when at the court they would say, hey, I'm not going to bother with it anymore, you know. We're going to make up, and I'm sorry for him, pardon him, and all of that. Well, we said, no, this shouldn't happen like that. Resuscitate the gender desk at CARICOM. I am happy to say that was done. We talk about gender sensitivity training, ensure there are active gender focal point persons in each government ministry. We talked about gender budgeting. I'm trying now to accelerate my pace so that I don't have to go on and on. Speedy enactment of the Juvenile Justice Bill, to consider the setting up a few pilots of community counseling. This is very important. The Commission met the President and we said to him, this is the way to go because community counseling will act as a preventative measure. It's a preventative measure to deal with domestic violence. We talked about the building code. Building code is very important for us as well because what is happening you have areas, and this is a cause for a lot of contention in communities. You have a proper house, then you have a mechanic shop, then you have somebody doing sawmilling work and all kinds of things, dust museum, and all of this thing is happening. So there is need to revert back to the building code. So that is something we are initiating. Gender training to be included in the health and family life education curriculum. I saw a stalwart of the Ministry of Education being here, Miss Miss Hamilton, yes. Yeah, she's our stalwart, and she would know about these things. We have long talked about these issues. And also the government to consider the establishment of a National Gender Advisory Committee. Government to consider the provision of paternity leave. You know what is paternity leave? And this is to assist women where there has been an addition to the family by both parties. So that not only women get maternity leave, fathers also get paternity leave. We're hoping that this will become a reality one day. We talked also about the need for flexible working hours, and we see COVID has made some of that possible, where you can work from home. But also we need to have more discussions as to how we can do the flexi time. Parenting skills, pre- and postnatal clinics in all health centers, a comprehensive sexual and reproductive age-appropriate health rights education in schools, encourage more male-friendly health centers. We don't only want our women to go to the health centers with the children, we also want our fathers to also take on that responsibility. Gender parity in Parliament and local government bodies. All documents should be clearly comprehensible to persons with disability, example, Braille. Equal NIS provision for widowers and widows. Provision of adequate public sanitary facilities accompanied by public awareness for proper use and maintenance. Implementation of responsive gender budgeting. This is 29, it is 55. I cannot continue any longer because there are other speakers. But if anyone is interested in knowing all these different recommendations that we have made, feel free to contact us at the Women and Gender Equality Commission. I must say that we feel very good about the work we do. And from some of those recommendations that I have referred to, it goes to show this is not about women only. This has to do with things affecting society, that our country can be a better place arising out of these concerns and these recommendations. Once they're adopted, we don't see why we cannot have improvement. So today's conference then is intended to provide you with much more information on CEDAW. I haven't spoken about that, only in the context of what it means for us and our mandate in the Commission. And I hope that when we have the workshops, you will engage in that so we can get your feedback, your responses as to how you feel. So, ladies and gentlemen, it has been my pleasure to share these insights with you. I know it has been a little bit long, but bear with me because there's always so much information we in the Commission want to share with the public out there. I thank you.
So, we come to the part where I have to introduce Dr. Kathleen Scott. So Dr. Kathleen Scott was introduced to me by way of the Institute of Gender Studies at the University of Guyana. She holds a PhD in, is it gender and development? Sociology, I stand corrected. And what I like about Dr. Scott is that she's able to break down complex things, and this is why I told her she was speaking. Complex things into very simple terms so that we all can understand. Now, it's not to say that you have difficulty learning, but I find that if I can understand something, I learn better when I hear things. I remember things. So what I want you to do is to be able to listen, hear things in a language that you can understand, and remember it, because we're going to test your knowledge this afternoon. Right, guys? All right? So please, she comes to you with a wealth of experience, and I hope that you'll find her presentation as interesting as I will, and I look forward to it. And without further ado, we will invite her to the stage so we can listen to what exactly is CEDAW that we've been hearing so much about. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Special good morning to the head table and to all of you folks out there who have taken the time to come. Special good morning to you. I feel particularly pleased. I'm particularly pleased to be here this morning because one of my greatest interests is to do with women and children. And every time I had to apply for some scholarship or funding for something, I would always put that as my major interest: marginalized women and children. So today is particularly pleasing for me to be here. When I got this request to be here today, I tried to find out what the audience would be like, because, you know, if you're just going to a trade union meeting or a class in the university, you know what your audience is going to be like, you know what to talk about. But when you come to something like this, it's a varied audience, and so you have to find something to make your presentation as interesting as possible. So before I go to my presentation, though, I didn't have this in what I wanted to say. I wanted to say thanks very much to Ms. Chandler Paul for giving that lengthy introduction talking about what the WGEC does. And I'm always concerned with the fact that most of these agencies, what they do, the knowledge of what they do remains the privilege of just a few persons, but it's not widely known in the community. So lots of times, the kinds of changes you would like to see, you really can't get them, because changes really do come from the communities. So to my topic, I was supposed to do something on, could you enable editing, please? Yeah, the committee asked me to do, the commission asked me to do something on CEDAW, and I was supposed to do what is CEDAW, how it works, and how would it affect grassroots communities. And I mean, anyone can go online, and it so happened this morning when I came in, there's a little booklet that tells you everything almost about CEDAW in a simple form. So I chose as my heading, the geographies of CEDAW, gender equality and violence against women. And I added violence against women because when I spoke to someone from the commission, I was told that, you know, this coincides with their 16 days of activism against violence against women, kind of tongue twister. But so I added that part, violence against women. And anytime you're going to talk about CEDAW and women, you must talk about gender equality. So here we go. The geographies of CEDAW, gender equality and violence against women. My introduction goes this way. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, is commonly referred to as the International Bill of Rights for Women. What is less frequently mentioned is the historical events that created a political space for the women's movement to pursue an agenda for gender equality, and in so doing, create a legal instrument that guarantees the human rights of women around the world. It is the contention here, my contention, that women's struggle for gender equality must be understood within the context of the anti-colonial struggles and the resulting growth of membership in the United Nations, a growth that produced a new United Nations and thus a safe political space from which the women's movement could pursue an agenda for gender equality and women's rights, and additionally focus on the universal issue of violence against women. Hence the interest in the geographies of CEDAW. Now, when you read about the women's movement and the women's rights, and even here in Guyana, it's never about one person or one place. And all that we enjoy today in terms of women's rights came from that movement. It was a social, worldwide movement. And so the geographies of the movement, you know, the people involved, the places where they came from, and a lot of that had to do with the United Nations. The United Nations began as a body in 1945, but by the 1960s and the 1970s, the complexion, if you want to put it in that way, of the United Nations had changed. And so that space that was created by the anti-colonial struggle and people gaining independence and going into the United Nations made a big difference. So I'm going to look at I'm going to use a timeline methodology to show how, as the United Nations changed, the programs for the women's movement changed. So I hope you find that interesting. So let's go again. Okay, let me say at the beginning here too, there will be limitations. I can't speak on everything. I can't cover every topic. There might be something you're interested in I don't mention, but, you know, I'm just within a time frame. Okay, the first thing is 1945. Okay, on October 24, 1945, the United Nations came into existence. Main purpose of the United Nations was maintaining international peace and security, protecting human rights, delivering humanitarian aid, promoting sustainable development, and upholding international law. I mean, from the very beginning, the United Nations was about these things: humanitarian rights, sustainable development, international law, etc. The body was then comprised of 51 states. By 2011, there were 193 states, and the last state to join the United Nations was Sudan. There were 160 signatories to the United Nations founding document at its Charter Conference in 1945. 4 of those signatories were women. 3 of those women were from countries we now refer to as the Third World. One of them was from Dominican Republic, the other one was from Brazil, the other one was from China, and the last one was from the United States. 4 women at that time, 160 signatories to the UN Charter. And they had some NGOs as well. And the NGOs were the Associated Country Women of the World, the International Alliance of Women, World Association of Girl Guides, World Young Women's Christian Association, and something called Zonta International. Most of these NGOs were headquartered outside, were headquartered inside of Europe or North America. So you see the complexion of the UN at the time, right? Everything that was an NGO was located in either Europe or North America. Importantly, the UN remains the only forum in which a global women's movement might engage governments in relation to agendas in which they are heavily invested. I want to say that again. The UN remains the only forum in which a global women's movement might engage governments in relation to agendas in which they are heavily invested. And when I was preparing this, I didn't know we'd have a UN rep. So I hope I'm not stepping on your grounds. But the UN is a very important body, so it's important, I think that it's important for me to mention, you know, something to do with them. Okay, by 1955, the UN country membership was 76. And I don't have every country listed, but by 1955, including countries such as Pakistan, Yemen, Cambodia, Ceylon, Jordan, Laos, and Libya. Now, some of these countries now, like Ceylon, for instance, they have changed their names, and I think Ceylon is now what we call Sri Lanka. By 1960, there were 99 members, including Ghana, the Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo, Gabon, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, Somalia, Togo, Upper Volta, Jamaica, Rwanda, Trinidad and Tobago, Kenya, Malta, Zambia, the Gambia, Maldives Islands, and Singapore. This is 1960. In 1964, this is not to do particularly with the UN, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed in the United Nations. And that act, even though we hear about it a lot, did not originally include women. Women had to fight to get the word sex included so that they would not have discrimination against women because of their sex, right? And that led to an organization known as NOW, National Organization of Women. So we see that there was a kind of historical struggle, and the momentum of that time was about change and including women in the national agenda. In 1966, the UN country membership was 102, and it then included Barbados, Botswana, Guyana, and Lesotho. In 1967, we had the Declaration of the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. That's like a precursor to CEDAW. The declaration, while it is not a law, is the first comprehensive legal measure on women's rights. And so you can make a note about CEDAW. It was the first comprehensive legal measure on women's rights. So then we go to 1971. In 1971, we saw the establishment of the 18-nation Arab Women's Commission of the Arab League. This was the first regional commission for women outside of the UN system since the birth of the world body. The new commission used CEDAW as its terms of reference. So by the time CEDAW was passed in 1967, 4 years later, the Arab Women's Conference of the Arab League was established, and it followed a similar pattern, which was to fight against the elimination of discrimination against women. By 1975, the UN membership totaled 144 countries, including Cape Verde, Mozambique, Papua New Guinea, Sao Tome, Suriname, Angola, and Vietnam. 1975 was also the year of the first World Conference on Women. That conference took place in Mexico City. More than 130 nations sent delegations to this conference. 75% of the delegations were women. Over 6,000 women representing the smallest South-based NGOs founded a space for their voice. Now, you have this conference in 1975, which is like 30 years after the founding of the United Nations, and you have 130 nations participating. And then in imagination, think of the complexion of the United Nations by this time. And so these women were able to find a space to bring their issues to the table. At that conference, a world plan of action was adopted. It was the first such document the world had seen to concentrate on problems and concerns of women. The General Assembly approved the recommendations of the Mexico City Conference and directed 1975 to 1985 to be observed as UN Decade for Women under the theme of equality, development, and peace. Equality, development, and peace. I want to say peace once again. By 1976, the United Nations Development Fund for Women, UNIFEM, was established as a small entity within the United Nations, and it is associated with the UNDP. Much of UNIFEM's work is in the area of ending violence against women, preventing sexual violence in times of conflict, and achieving gender equality in democratic governance in times of peace as well as war. And I brought in this piece about UNIFEM's work because one of the areas in which they work is preventing violence in times of conflict. And if you pay attention, you know there's a lot of conflict going on all over the world. And between, I think it's 2000 to 2011 or something like that. I can't remember the exact dates. But there were almost 24 countries that there was conflict. And so you know that in conflict times, what happens to women? There's much more violence. There's much more violence against women. By 1979, the UN country membership was 152, including Dominica, St. Lucia, and the Solomon Islands. And that was the same year, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women was adopted by the UN General Assembly and came into force in 1981. The principal idea of CEDAW was discrimination. Discrimination against women includes, and this is the meaning that they give, any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex that has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying women's employment of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. This is irrespective of their marital status on a basis of equality of men and women. This convention, most English-speaking Caribbean countries are parties to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women. So there are two conventions, two articles, two legal things that we adhere to in the Caribbean to fight violence against women. Guyana has directly incorporated provisions of these conventions into its domestic law. By virtue of an amendment, and Mr. Paul spoke about that, Guyana has directly incorporated provisions of these conventions into its domestic law by virtue of an amendment to the Constitution in 2003. The Constitution guarantees the protection of those rights and sets out in Human Rights Convention to which it is a state party. Over a 21-year span of time, and of all the documents produced by each of the four of the United Nations World Conference for Women, CEDAW is the only document produced and bestowed with the power to bind member nations to fulfill its provisions in accordance with international law. CEDAW is also currently the sole document in the form of a binding international treaty that addresses a broad spectrum of women's issues with potentially far-reaching domestic campaigns. Women's movements have successfully used international treaties such as CEDAW and political pressure to pass new domestic violence legislation. However, implementation of these laws have been woefully inadequate. Now, that's like a good story about CEDAW, but CEDAW has its limitations. One of them is that, let me see where I have that note. The limitations, reservations. Oh, I mentioned about the signatories to CEDAW. But what we have is, even though, where did I have it? How many countries? Anyway, even though so many countries have signed on to CEDAW, 2 countries have not signed on. Well, not signed on, but not ratified. They've signed but not ratified. The 2 countries are the United States of America and Palau. It's spelled capital P-A-L-A-U. P-A-L-A-U. So it's United States and a country by the name of Palau. They have signed but not ratified the convention. So the other limitations and or reservations of CEDAW is basically in 2 areas. Even though the original convention didn't speak directly about violence against women, adjustments were made, legal adjustments, and it was, the language was changed to facilitate issues about violence against women. But there are now calls for a specific bill to deal with domestic violence, not coming out of CEDAW. CEDAW would remain there, but need a specific bill to deal with violence against women. The other one has to do a lot with this discourse about human rights versus cultural rights. Coming out of the CEDAW Convention, there's this discourse about human rights and cultural rights, right? So the contention is, are the cultural norms of a society more important than the human rights? So that remains a contention. And at this point, I want to give you, because I was supposed to talk on CEDAW, a little way that it has been used in practical terms. And I particularly like this article because it's entitled, "What Would Gandhi Say? Reconciling Universalism, Cultural Relativism, and Feminism Through Women's Use of CEDAW." And it's written by somebody who is a lawyer. Are there any lawyers in this house? There are. Okay. You can probably relate to, the use of CEDAW as a legal document. But they have used this CEDAW thing, and I want to give you a couple of instances in which the law has been used. So I'm going to read, it's not there. This is a network of scholars, researchers, and activists in the Southwest Forum. Dawn seeks to support women's mobilization in civil society, to challenge inequitable social, economic, and political relations at global, regional, and national levels, and to advance feminist theories. So we have coming out of this whole women's movement, you have the Arab League, and now you have Dawn operating in the South, which included places like Guyana. In 1985, you have the Third World Conference for Women that was held in Nairobi, Kenya. Participants included 2,000 delegates from 157 member states. So by that time, the United Nations had gone to 157 from its original 51. A parallel NGO forum attracted 14,000 participants. Governments adopted the Nairobi Forward-Looking Strategies for the Advancement of Women, which outlined measures for achieving gender equality at the national level and for promoting women's participation in peace and development efforts. So this was a big conference, the Nairobi Conference in Kenya. And then we go to 1991. This is not so much on the map, but in doing my research, I found it. The Center for Women's Global Leadership. They organized a strategic planning meeting of grassroots activists from 20 countries. The meeting focused on gender-based violence against women as an issue that violates the human rights of women. The meeting focused on gender-based violence against women. And the meeting also called for a global campaign that would take up various strategies for linking women's rights to human rights, including an annual period of global action. And I suppose that's why we now have 16 days of activism coming out of this Global Women's Center meeting in 1991. They wanted to have an annual period of global action, a petition drive, and a documentation of violence against women. And one of the previous speakers spoke about that there needs to be more documentations of instances of violence. In 1993, the Vienna Conference, the Global Center organized once again a strategic planning meeting. What emerged was a global tribunal on violation of women's human rights. The tribunal featured women from 25 countries who had survived a vast range of human rights abuses, from domestic violence to political persecution to violations of economic rights. I just want to make a little mention at this point when they said political prosecution. Political prosecution comes from both sides because, there's talk about political participation, women having representation in parliament. And I came across an article that spoke a lot about the abuse that women who enter parliament, the abuse that they face. It's taken that, you now have a privilege, you're in parliament and what have you, but women in parliament across the globe, they face persecution. And there are women who are, who are striving to have their voices heard in the political space, and they too are persecuted. So these are all issues that the women who are part of the women's movement, these are all issues that they take up. Then in 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women was held in Beijing, and this marked a significant turning point for the global agenda for gender equality. The Beijing Declaration, the Platform for Action, adopted unanimously by 189 countries, was an agenda for women's empowerment and is now considered a key global policy document on gender equality. It sets strategic objectives and actions for the advancement of women and achievement of gender equality in 12 critical areas of concern. Many indigenous women contributed to this delegation. By the time the conference got to Beijing, they had added another component of women. Indigenous women were present, visibly present at the conference in Beijing. Remember how the UN started, with 4 NGOs, all located in either Europe or America. Now, so that brings me basically to the end of my timeline. This is the 1995 Beijing conference, and in it I incorporated the whole idea of CEDAW and what it means and what have you. So, and I'll have to talk something a little bit about violence against women, because we're dealing about, violence against women all the time. And I know you're organized under the hashtag Unite Activism to End Violence Against Women and Girls. And when you have a hashtag and you're uniting for activism, you're supposed to be, anybody got their hands up ready to get action going? Okay, nobody. I'm just going to give 2 quick definitions here of gender-based violence, and then I'm kind of changed up a bit, and I've been talking a long time, so I'm going to kind of get you involved in the discussion. Gender-based violence has been defined by the Commission on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women: violence that is directed against a woman because she's a woman, or that affects women disproportionately. It includes acts that inflict physical, mental, or sexual harm or suffering, threats of such acts, coercion, and other deprivations of liberty. It is a form of discrimination that seriously inhibits women's ability to enjoy rights and freedoms on the basis of equality with men. This comes from the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And this definition came after the original definition of discrimination, because there were representations made for more emphasis to be placed more precisely on what you meant about, violence against women. It can't be just discrimination. There were no mentions of words like abuse or rape or anything of the sort. So this is a new definition. And then the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence defines violence against women as any act or conduct based on gender which causes death or physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, whether in the public or the private sphere. Gender-based violence takes many forms: domestic violence, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, all of which disproportionately affect women. So I'm just going to give those couple of definitions, because I know most of you here know the whole thing about the number about 1 in 3 women in their lifetime have been, experienced some form of abuse. And for me, it's kind of, I call it airy-fairy statistic, because 1 in 3 women across the globe, if you go to China and Asia alone, that contains more than half of the world's population. So if you say 1 in 3, it might look as if it's not so prevalent if you really think about it, because it's the whole global population you're talking about. So that's why it's important for you to, on the ground, do your own work and understand what's really happening in your country, right? And then the other thing about violence against women is that we know it can either be physical or non-physical. And in both cases, it can lead to death. Physical violence The man could take a gun and shoot you, what have you. And emotional violence, it goes on over time, undetected, and it can lead to depression and eventually suicide. So any one of the two, whether it's physical violence or non-physical, you can have that resulting. Sexual violence is the same thing. A woman who is raped might result in an unwanted pregnancy. She might have an unsafe abortion, and she can lose her life, right? So that's my take on CEDAW and domestic and violence against women. But I wanted to kind of, don't have you just looking at me, and I have some questions here. And somebody said there are already lawyers in the house, but I wanted to know if there are any housewives or self-employed persons in this gathering here today. Anybody like that? Anybody who identifies just as a care worker, somebody who takes care of people in the home? Okay, there's somebody like that. Or they didn't hear me. Let me say it again. Anybody in the audience here who is a housewife or a care worker or a self-employed person like a cosmetologist or hairdresser or anything like that? Anybody who's a grandmother? Nobody want to know the age? Okay. Okay. The next question that I have is, the next bit of the way to involve you guys. Now, anybody here who is number 4? Who's number 2? Anybody here who is police? Why everybody laughing? Any police in your house? I mean, you got to be proud of yourself, you know. Come, okay. We got the police, we got the housewife, somebody from Human Services, and somebody from a women's NGO. Somebody from a women's NGO. Okay, now I gave out 4 little pieces of paper, and on them there's a little prompt for you to answer. So the persons who have gotten them, Renata, you have a mic that they could use? Okay, if you can, Renata will assist you, and so you could read the question and read what is said in the paper so that the rest of the audience could hear.
Of the community. For example, in the Bushlock community, the people in the community will be able to identify what are the issues and therefore can be able to implement strategies that can help the women and educate the women in areas how to decrease the number of violence in their households. And more than that, is how can we help the men? What can be done to help the men in these situations? Because for me, I see many of these cases as men crying out for help, right? And there's no avenue because we're putting the resources into the women. The men also need help. And so how can we address issues in this community as I'm looking at how can we help our men in problem solving and anger management or conflict resolution? Thank you.
So I'll pause my presentation. I was doing that so you could get a feeling of what domestic violence is from your own point of view, not mine, not what's been written in the books. But we have a rep here who has to move on, And so we'll just take a pause and then come back to this. Thank you very much.
So, next on the agenda, we are privileged to have the UN Resident Coordinator, Ms. Yashim Orak. She comes to us, she's born in Turkey. She's of Turkish descent, she's born in the US. She did her degrees in political science from the fancy university called Yale. She's had a wealth of experience in the UN, and she certainly held management positions in at the United Nations for over 20 years. So she's coming to us with a wealth of experience. Her task today is to bring to us the stories of CEDAW from around the world, particularly the success stories. Because oftentimes we hear about these treaties and we think, oh yeah, this is sort of a airy-fairy thing, and they don't actually impact on our everyday lives. CEDAW is, however, somewhat different, and it has impacted on our lives in ways that we have not begun to notice as yet. It's because it's become so de facto. So I want you to put your hands together, please, and give Ms. Orak a warm welcome. She will enthrall us with her stories.
Good morning, all. Wow, you've been an amazingly thoughtful audience. It's been a long morning so far, and I certainly don't want to be a talking head in this event on marking CEDAW. But first, allow me to observe protocols. First of all, great thanks and greetings to Chairperson Chandrapal, and thank you for inviting me, as well as to the Deputy Chairperson and other commissioners of the Gender Equality Commission. Dr. Scott, wow, I am so jealous. I wish I was making that presentation and you were making mine. That was an amazing run-through while I greet you in the Presidium. What a wonderful run-through of the history of the UN, the women's movement, and how that links to a history of liberation, anti-colonialism, and growth of the organization that I am so proud to serve, to become the world organization rather than the organization of a select few. And I think your description of how the UN evolved in the journey, on the gender equality journey, is the story of how we try to become that inclusive, that big organization that is relevant to everybody, for nations big and small, for nations rich and poor. And I think the story of the UN, I wish I could say it is the story of always liberation, of always peace. It aspires to be, and in the absence of anything else, I hate to say it, we're the best option that the world has right now for that story of peace, inclusion, and growth. And the story of, thank you, thank you. And I'm very honored and proud to represent the United Nations here in Guyana. Members of the civil society, I recognize so many of you and some of you, so I've been here 1 year, a little over a year, and it's my great pleasure to be able to wave to the audience and see friends and colleagues in civil society, occupational representatives, members of trade unions, grandparents, I understand, are also in the room, so that's also wonderful. But greetings to you all, media, of course, and good morning. It is absolutely great pleasure and honor for me to be here, to see how CEDAW has impacted, to talk about how CEDAW and the assignment I have has been used by women in different countries around the world to advance the rights of women. And thank you for inviting us to this. I cannot overemphasize, overstress how important such discussions are for regularly taking stock of CEDAW, how it's going in Guyana, and because every day when I open the newspaper, and I think Professor Scott made mention of that too, every day I see some story or another in Guyana, in my home country, Turkey, which Renata mentioned, of gross violations of the rights of women. So therefore, when we see all of these things, we listen to the experiences of women, friends, we're reminded repeatedly of the urgency, of the importance, the significance to advance this women's Bill of Rights, CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. I must also acknowledge there are many government representatives in the House, I understand. Minister Teixeira would have been here had she not fallen ill this morning, but I must acknowledge Guyana's commitment to CEDAW. Since its signature, it's becoming signatory to it. Guyana signed and ratified the convention, one of the early signers on of the convention in 1980, and has been a consistent devoted member of the CEDAW working groups and CEDAW processes, and for that I applaud the government of Guyana. Over the last some 4 decades or so, CEDAW has been a force for good for women's lives across the world. In so doing, I will actually touch today on 6 issues, so remind me if I don't touch on all 6. And I'll try to keep it short because I know you've been a very thoughtful and listening audience, and that little exercise that was starting there seemed to be far more fun than listening to the UN representative talk about CEDAW. But the 6 issues. One is the definition, and Professor Scott mentioned that CEDAW introduced a definition of discrimination against women. So important definition. The second one is legal frameworks. National legal frameworks for protection of the rights of women. And within that national legal frameworks, it's what governments do, it's what NGOs do, and it's what judicial activists do, which Professor Scott also mentioned in passing. The third is a development context, global and national development policies from education, health, low-carbon development strategy. Those are also around the world been impacted by CEDAW. Fourth is the NGOs and the whole reporting mechanism. Finally, it's the optional protocol. Fifth is the optional protocol and individuals being able to use CEDAW to raise issues to global and to the global convention mechanisms. That's not final, that's before final. And finally, the role of human rights institutions, of which the Gender Equality Commission, Women's Equality Commission is an example. Number 1, definitions. I started at the outset talking about the UN being the only instrument we have for that global agreement on issues, on development, on rights. CEDAW is so important because it represents a definition of discrimination, which Professor Scott read very clearly, which prohibits any distinction, which defines discrimination against women, prohibits any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the enjoyment and exercise of rights by women on an equal basis. These definitions are important because member states of the United Nations, as Professor Scott mentioned, they range from countries that do not enjoy the democratic rights that we enjoy here in Guyana, that have very different cultural traditions, that come from very different historical conditions. Therefore, all member states agreeing on a definition of discrimination is a very, very important first step. And in that context, I'm very proud that the convention also describes gender-based violence as an explicit discrimination against women. And you also mentioned that in your presentation. So when we talk about discrimination against women, it's not just that that the convention looks at whether women are getting equal pay for equal work, if women's jobs are paying as well, or if women are entering into the labor force as much as men are, or if women are getting right to health care as much as men are. It's not just that. It is also the whole area of gender-based violence. So I think it's very important to acknowledge that. Furthermore, the second point is the convention has been used by governments, NGOs, and judiciaries around the world to advance legal frameworks. The convention contains key normative international standards that can be incorporated into domestic laws, regulations, policies, and practices. For instance, in Mongolia, it has fostered the adoption of a law on gender equality. In Rwanda, it has It has led, the CEDAW has been used to create and enact laws prohibiting sex-based discrimination in access to land ownership, which is a big area of dispute in many, many countries, where women do not have same inheritance rights as men. In my own country, of course, Turkey, my home country, domestic violence laws have been introduced, along with in Nepal, South Africa, Republic of Korea, which have criminalized domestic violence or all forms of violence against women. Similarly, in criminalizing femicide in Panama, or trafficking laws in Ukraine and Moldova. So in many countries, the state party has used CEDAW to put forward legal frameworks to, for instance, criminalize gender-based violence, or to clarify issues of sex trafficking or anti-trafficking or gender equality in their own countries. In the Caribbean region, where we are, of course, ratification of CEDAW has led many countries to include legal measures to prevent and punish acts of violence against women, improving access to justice by establishing fair and effective legal procedures for victims, establishing necessary legal and administrative mechanisms to ensure that victims of violence have access to just and effective remedy. In many countries, however, NGOs have also used the CEDAW to advance for legal change in their countries. And I have multiple notes on